Welcome everybody to the Newcastle Institute, looking at the voice and particularly the challenge we have in the context for our past history, and currently we're being asked to look at and make a decision about the voice for a better future for Australia. The Newcastle Institute is about rational and respectful debate about diverse ideas, and that's the flavour in which we will undertake the session tonight. As always, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we stand, the land of the Wangkumarra people, and recognise that for thousands of years people have been having debate and discussion on this land here about a whole range of diverse ideas, and I think it's important more than any time to acknowledge that tonight. We're very lucky to have two speakers here tonight to discuss the ideas around the voice. Firstly, we've got Sean Gordon, immediately on my left, AM. And Sean is the Managing Director and owner of Barkindji Group, 100% Indigenous owned business. Originally, he's a Wangkumarra and Barkindji man. Hopefully I've got those pronunciations correctly. Sean's a strong advocate and has been for a long time about self-determination for Indigenous communities and for social, cultural and economic empowerment. Recently awarded the Order of Australia Medal for decades of service to the Indigenous communities and as an advocate for equity. In applying his considerable leadership skills, he drives Indigenous development and attempts to establish independence through creating real opportunities and benefits for individuals, organisations and communities. Sean is also Chief Executive of Uluru Foundation, a partnership model which allows students, families and communities to work closely with schools for a good path for their children to success in education, thriving and fulfilling life. Sean recently completed employment with the Barkindji Local Aboriginal Council, where he served as Chief Executive Officer for 9 years, and a leading New South Wales Land Council focused on improving the health and wellbeing of New South Wales Central Coast community. Sean serves on advisory boards and advisory committees, including a member of the Indigenous Advisory Board for Woolworths, the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Board for the Commonwealth Bank, the Max Solutions and the Insurance Council of Australia. He's also a member of the CEO Advisory Committee of the Commonwealth Bank, the chair of the Uphold and Recognise and former chairperson of the Empowered Communities National Leadership Group. Now that's exhausting. He was just telling me that he's got a busy day tomorrow, and now I understand why. We also have Dr. Damien Freeman. Damien is the Principal Policy Advisor at the PM Glynn Institute at the Australian Catholic University, a public policy think tank, and is also a founding director of Uphold and Recognise. Uphold and Recognise is a not-profit organisation that promotes discussion of how we can recognise Indigenous Australians without disturbing the way that the Constitution operates. Uphold and Recognise has formed an alliance with Liberals for Yes to campaign for a successful yes vote in this year's referendum on constitutional recognition through a voice to Parliament. His publications, so Damien's publications, include collection of which he is the co-editor, The Forgotten People, Liberal and Conservative Approaches to Recognising Indigenous People, and Statement from the Soul, The Moral Case for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Please join me in welcoming these two guest speakers tonight. So the format for tonight is that we're going to have presentations by Damien and Sean, some facilitated questions, and then we're going to hand it over to you. And as Sean and Damien said before, they want you to ask any questions about the voice so that you can be informed in making your decision when the referendum comes. So I'll hand over to Damien first.
Is it better in the stand or if I hold it? If I have it like that, is that gonna? That's working? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here with Sean tonight to discuss this with you. As you know, we're all going to have a vote on it sometime this year. We don't know exactly what date yet, but we know that it's going to be in the next 4 or so months. And you know, everyone has to turn their mind to this. And I appreciate that it's a difficult thing to think about. It's not something, the Constitution's not something that we're all familiar with thinking about. Most people probably haven't had to think about it since 1999. And, that's part of the privilege of living in the country we live in. The Constitution works well, and therefore we don't need to worry about it. You only need to worry about a Constitution when things are going wrong. And I appreciate that. And I come from a kind of tradition that's very much about protecting things, preserving things that work, maintaining the things that we value because they've served us well for a long time. And I'm certainly the kind of person who's very cautious of changing anything to do with the Constitution. In 1999, I was an undergraduate. I was very actively involved in the case against the Republic referendum because I wasn't at all convinced that was a good idea. But I've been involved with this, the development of this idea, and I want to say a bit about how we came to this proposal and why I think it's a good proposal and a proposal that you ought to consider supporting on referendum day. So you probably recall that in 2007, John Howard fought his last election against Kevin Rudd, and he lost that election. But in the lead up to the election campaign, he gave a speech, not at the Newcastle Institute, but at the Sydney Institute, and he said in that speech, he committed himself that if he was returned, he would hold a referendum to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. And that was really the beginning of the story of how we got to where we got to now. Every Prime Minister since then, and indeed opposition leader, committed him or herself to constitutional recognition, and the political class was broadly committed to the idea that we should have a referendum to recognise the Indigenous people in the Constitution. So that's really how the politicians get to the point that they're committed to doing this. The other side of this, of course, is the Indigenous people. If you're going to recognise a group of people, you're going to have a conversation with them about what do they think it means to be recognised? What is going to count as meaningful recognition to them? Because there's no point trying to recognise any group of people in a way that is not going to seem like meaningful recognition to them. So, of course, the next step in the process is to start consulting the Indigenous people. This happened with the expert panel report, and what we had there was a long consultation with Indigenous people, and they then started to explain what they thought this meant, right? They're starting to talk about what they think it means to be recognised. And what's apparent is when they're talking about being recognised in the Constitution, they're not talking about some sort of nice symbolic statement, right? They're talking about something that speaks to a long history of advocacy that certainly goes back at least to the 1930s, right? There you can see around the country different Aboriginal advocates have been working since the 1930s, calling for something like this. And what are they calling for? They're calling for some kind of guarantee that the future will be different from the past. That given everything that's happened in the past in Australia to Indigenous people, and none of us are proud about the things that happened, but given what's happened, how can we ensure that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have reason to believe that the future will be different from the past. And that's what they're saying, recognition in the Constitution. It's recognition of what happened, and it's recognition that we need to do things better in the future, and that we as Australian people are committing ourselves to doing that. So they put forward a proposal for what was called a racial non-discrimination clause. And constitutional conservatives immediately said this was a bad idea, and they explained why they would oppose it. And they would oppose it because they believed it would result in empowering the High Court to make political decisions. It was called a one-clause Bill of Rights, and it was said to be inconsistent with our tradition. And I was broadly in that camp, and I understood that, and I was having conversations with Noel Pearson and some of these people. And the question then that was put to us was, well, if you think that's not the way to solve this problem, then what do you think is the way to solve the problem? Because you must admit there's a problem that needs to be solved, so how can we find a way of solving it? And that's when we started to think about, well, how could we do something that on the one hand recognised the Indigenous people and on the other hand upheld the Constitution? That we like the way the Constitution works. We don't want to change the relationship between the High Court and the Parliament. We don't want to create some new entity that will diminish the power of the Parliament. So how could we do something here that would, on the one hand, recognise the aspirations of Indigenous people, and on the other hand recognise the legitimate concerns that some of us who called ourselves constitutional conservatives had? And so the basic idea that emerged from this, and that ultimately was recognised in the Uluru Statement, was to say, look, the Constitution gives the Commonwealth Parliament, the Australian Parliament, power to make laws about different things, right? The Parliament can only make laws about topics that the Constitution has given it power to make laws about. One of those powers is to make special laws for the people of any race who it's deemed necessary to make laws. That's only ever been used for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the Constitution allows Parliament to make special laws for these one group of people, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people. And the point that was made to us is, well, you know, in the past, governments thought they knew best. They were paternalist. They tried to do the right thing. It turned out not to be the right thing. And what they said is, well, they didn't listen to us. They didn't talk to us. They didn't understand where we were at and what we needed. So the suggestion was, well, if the Constitution is going to allow the Parliament to make special laws for Indigenous people, which is an unusual thing, right? This is the only case where there's one group of people for whom the Constitution allows Parliament to make special laws. The Parliament never has done this for any other group of people. If the Constitution's going to allow that, then surely, given our history, the Constitution ought to say, you can make whatever laws you want about Indigenous people, but you've at least got to hear what they think first. You've at least got to hear their voices. Once you've heard their voices, it's still up to the Parliament to make whatever laws it wants. We'll preserve the sovereignty of Parliament. Nothing will undermine the Parliament because Parliament is accountable to the people. Parliament has to decide what are the best laws to make in Indigenous affairs, like it has to decide about everything else. But the Constitution will at least require that if you're going to make these special laws, you have to at least make provision for these people's voices to be heard by the Parliament before you make the laws. And that's how we got going with this idea, because this was an idea that we believed was consistent with the Constitution. It didn't increase the power of the High Court. It did not diminish the power of the Parliament. It kept all the structures in place and the same, but it gave a guarantee to Indigenous people that their voices would be heard. And that gives Indigenous people a reason to believe that the future will be different from the past. And that's really at the core here of what recognition is. It's recognising what's happened in the past. It's recognising where we're at now. It's recognising that we're all committed to things being done better when it comes to Indigenous affairs in the future. And, for most of us, we've thrived in this country. We value the country. We like the country the way it is. I think most people would probably admit that when it comes to Indigenous affairs, it's not exactly been our finest hour. I'm not saying that there haven't been any successes, but it's certainly not an area where we have really thrived, and we know the problems, that we're still trying to close the gap. So this is meant to be a way that we can deal with this need for recognition, but at the same time deal with the need to uphold the Constitution and to avoid any uncertainty and to make sure that we'll continue to be the kind of stable country that we are. So that's how I, as a Conservative, as someone who was cautious about changing the Constitution, have come to a point where I'm now saying I think this is a good way to recognise Indigenous people. I think this is something that we could come together to do. So at that point, I think I'll hand over to Sean, and he can offer you his perspective about this.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Robin, for your wonderful welcome. I'd just like to also acknowledge country, acknowledge that we're on the land of the Awabakal people, pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge my people, the Wangkumarra and Barkindji people. And thank you all for coming tonight. One of the interesting things of this audience, the polls tell us that you're all non-supporters of the voice, according to the polls. It's the 65 plus that we've got to convince to support it, according to the polls. I'm only going to go on the polls, but the reality is, the 65 plus. Well, maybe it's not that case, but Damien and I have been working in this space for a long time, and when I compared Damien and myself, I'm not sure if you remember a show many years ago called Hear No Evil, See No Evil, Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder, and obviously I'm Richard Pryor. But Damien and I have been working together for near a decade now on Indigenous constitutional recognition. And the space that we work in, interesting enough, is on the right of politics. And so we work with Conservatives and Liberals in bringing Conservatives and Liberals on the journey of Indigenous constitutional recognition. And people would probably argue to say that we're not having much success. Whereas I would argue the opposite and think and say that I think we've had substantial success over the past 10 years in having those conversations. And I caught up with a good friend yesterday to try and understand the challenge that we face in this space of trying to get the Australian public to support the referendum. And it's simply about how do you get people to say yes. And I'm still trying to understand that, and the only way in which I can speak to this is to really speak about my own history and to speak about my experiences. And for where I am today, I find myself very fortunate, very privileged to be in the position I am. I sat on the referendum working group, and Ken White and myself were sort of the only two right-leaning people sitting on that committee to try and advocate to those members. So you can appreciate it was interesting conversations over that period of time in that room. But the outcome that we landed on, I think was in the end was the right outcome with the amendment and the question that is now put to the Australian people. And I'm also quite relieved with the process because for me it just got caught up into the Parliament for too long. And I think the politicians made a mess of this. They made a mess of it on both sides. No one was innocent in regards to it, particularly given the role of Parliament and politicians over the many years and their failures in Indigenous affairs, going back decades. And so for me, for the politicians to get stuck on a debate around what's right and what's wrong, given their failures and their experiences over those years, it was just unfortunate. But I stand here. I'm not a politician. I'm not an academic, and I'm definitely not a lawyer. I regard myself as a practitioner, and as a practitioner, I get to work in Aboriginal communities right across the country. And one of my colleagues sitting in the room here that I worked with for many years, Heather, had the opportunity to travel around the country with me into those remote communities and working with those communities to help organise themselves, to form structures that empowered them to be able to start to take responsibility for the things that existed within their community. And it's until you do this work in these remote communities, until you go out and see just how disempowered, disenfranchised and disconnected these communities are from the rest of the country, until you do that, you don't have a full appreciation of the challenges that exist between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, between Indigenous people and the structures of government. For decades now, governments have overreached into the day-to-day lives of Indigenous people. And when I say overreach, they reach from the very minute that you were born until the time that you pass away. And this overreach is fairly consistent across all communities, where people are telling you what to do in every aspect of your life in regards to how you move forward. And it's through this overreach of governments that I've really started to focus my energy and efforts on working with Indigenous communities to ensure that they are empowered to take responsibility to lead the change that exists in their communities. I'm the independent chair for the Barkly Regional Deal in Central Northern Territory in the Tennant Creek region. And as the independent chair for that body, I was brought in to try and reshape it and reset the relationship between governments and community. And to demonstrate this process of this government overreach that exists within these communities, when I turned up, there were more government people sitting in the room than there were Indigenous people. There were 4 Indigenous people sitting in the room. But the conversations that were being had were about Indigenous people and the challenges that existed in the community, whether they were health, housing, education, justice, and so on. And as I sat there in the first meeting trying to understand why it is that we're sitting in a room with 15 government people and 4 Indigenous people from the community, how it is that we're expecting to fix this problem that exists and the challenges that exist within this community with this power imbalance that exists, that the people that are funding the programs, the people that regulate the programs, the people that implement the programs and oversee those programs are here keeping themselves to account in regards to how they're going on delivering the outcomes. For me, it just didn't make sense. When I sit in that meeting today, there are 14 Indigenous people sitting in the room and 3 to 4 government people sitting in the room who are key decision makers, who are there to listen and there to be able to respond in regards to the needs of that community and what it is they need to do. Because one of the challenges that exist and why the question itself asked for a voice to Parliament to be enshrined in the Constitution and a voice to executive government to be enshrined in the Constitution, because it's not just the decisions that ministers make within this space. Ministers, most ministers that I've dealt with over the many years have good intent. Most politicians that I've dealt with over the many years have good intent in regards to the types of policies that they want to make. Where they fail is in execution. And where they fail is when the decisions then go from good intent to others that may want to interpret the way in which legislation and policies are being developed and how they then roll them out. And so sometimes it's in the bureaucracy that much of the control takes place in regards to how communities deliver those programs and the type of outcomes that are achieved. And so it's important to understand the disempowerment and why it is Indigenous people have asked for a voice to Parliament and to executive government, because it is about accountability. But more importantly for me, it is about responsibility. It is about shifting the responsibility away from government and putting responsibility back in the hands of Indigenous people to start to take control. Because I, for one, I'm well and truly over turning up every year and hearing the Close the Gap report telling us that we're not having success in this country. That's not a failure on Indigenous people. That is a failure on us as a nation. That today that we can accept that there is one group of people in this country that are so far behind in all of the disparity gaps that we fail and struggle to come up with a solution. And the challenge I see right now in the progressive no side, when I think about the challenge that Dutton has, he's got two extremes sitting within his camp. One is Lydia Thorpe, who would love for all of you to get back on a boat and go back to where you come from, as a solution to this country. But that is the reality of what Lydia is proposing. She is proposing a solution that all non-Indigenous people get out of the way, and we want to push forward as a sovereign group of people. You've got the other end, which is Jacinta's position. And Jacinta's position is that all Indigenous people would just become white and just assimilate and become a part of society. And that is the reality of the two worlds that have been put together. One is that you go away. The other is that we become one of the 97%. The process of constitutional recognition and the Uluru process, and I participated in the dialogues. I participated at Uluru and played a key role in the development of the Uluru Statement. I set up at the Yulara Resort at 5 o'clock in the morning with Noel Pearson and another gentleman by the name of Jimmy Bostock, who has since passed away. We sat in that cafe and we were reading the Uluru Statement and thinking about whether we top and tailed a particular statement. But in producing the Uluru Statement, from the people that were sitting in that convention to sitting there with Noel and Jimmy in that cafe in the morning and having that conversation, it was written with good intent. It wasn't about putting people on a boat and sending them back to wherever it is they were meant to have come from. And it wasn't about us giving up who we are as Indigenous people, but saying to the Australian people, we want you to accept us as Indigenous people and for who we are. We want you to bring our 65,000-year history and bring it together with our 230-year history and weave that history together. We want you to be able to learn who we are and celebrate our culture and understand our practices, but not change who we are. We want to be able to embrace and not change who you are, but accept that we can come together as people, we can come together as a nation, still celebrate our differences, but understand what makes us unique as a country is that we are able to come together in this melting pot of multicultural Australia. But imagine what a world looks like, a post-referendum world looks like, a successful post-referendum world looks like, when you weave 65,000 years of Indigenous culture with 230 years of who we are today as a country, how unique that makes us. We become the oldest living culture in the world, sustained and practiced today. I'll tell you a story that continues to keep driving me, and my passion and drive in this space will never wane whilst I experience these types of stories. But to share with you that I was up at the Darwin motel, the airport motel, and I'm standing at the counter, and there was a young girl come up, and she grabbed a chocolate and a drink and an ice block, and she walked up to the counter to pay for it. And I'm standing there watching her, and the lady went over to serve her, and she just said, "I can't serve you." And I was watching, and she had a card, and I'm thinking, I wonder why she can't serve her. And then I sort of watched, and then she's sort of looking at the card, and she's thinking, well, I don't know, I'm giving you my card. It wasn't until I switched on that the card was a cashless debit card. And the hotel accommodation didn't accept a cashless debit card. And the cashless debit card is a card that quarantines 80% of your income and only gives you access to 20% of your income. When I looked at the devastation on that young girl's face, the emotions hit me, the anger hit me, that here is a card that was specifically set up and developed and targeted to one group of people, Indigenous people within the Northern Territory. That this young girl, she's only 10, 11 year old, that this young girl couldn't go and purchase herself a chocolate out of the money that her mother had on this card. So I said to the lady at the counter, just chuck it on my room and I'll fix it up. And I just nodded to her and said, take it and go away. But how is that fair? How is that equitable? That this one specific group of people in the Northern Territory can be targeted through a single card that puts them in a separate line, that dehumanises and humiliates them, but we accept that as a country. You know, this is the strange reality that I get as an Indigenous person within the country. I think about my people, the Wangkumarra people, very proud people from the corner country, the New South Wales, South Australia, Queensland border. And so you can appreciate tonight if New South Wales win, I'm a New South Wales person. If Queensland win, I'm on the other side. You know, there's Wangkumarra's in Queensland and Barkindji's in New South Wales. But you know, my people were put on the back of cattle trucks. 117 Wangkumarra people were put on the back of cattle trucks in 1938. Think about this country in 1938 and what we were preparing to do in 1938. Does anyone know what we were preparing to do in 1938? We were planning to go to war. And we were planning to go to war against Nazi Germany for the treatment of my fellow brother over here, of his ancestors, and the way in which they were treating his ancestors. But in 1938, while this country was preparing to go to war to fight another country for the way in which they were treating a particular people, my people, 117 Wangkumarra people, were placed on the back of 3 cattle trucks, transported 500 kilometres away to the Brewarrina Mission. And the Brewarrina Mission is where I grew up, in a foster home with 24 Aboriginal kids. And every one of those kids' parents came through that mission. And so a decision that was made in 1938 impacted my life, born in 1970. But a decision made much earlier than that, impacted my life. It started with the Constitution in 1901. The Constitution failed to recognise that there was a group of people here first. And in failing to do that, it allowed state and territories to make laws that impacted on those group of people. Then in 1909, the New South Wales government passed a law that allowed for the Wangkumarra people to be removed from their country to a mission where they were forced to assimilate, forced not to practice culture, language and so on, which then impacted my great-great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, my parents, where my parents were incapable of being able to raise me and my brother. And so we grew up in a foster home, raised by Ashley Gordon's, and we all know Ashley Gordon, the Newcastle Knight, raised by his grandparents. I was raised by his grandparents in a foster home. But that's the reality of our history, is that as a nation, we put up our young men, we go to another country to fight, to protect a group of people, whilst at the same time harming a group of people through similar practices. This is what we have to come to terms with, and this is what we struggle with as a nation. And this is why, for me, what was put forward at the Uluru Convention and what was put to the Australian people was a reasonable ask. We didn't overreach. We didn't ask for people to go back to wherever they came from. We didn't say to our people that you have to assimilate. We said to our people, we have to find a place in which we can come together as a nation, in which we can collectively move forward. So as Damien says, that the future is going to be better than the past. And so I'm not here to tell people how to vote. I can tell you how I'm going to vote. I'm going to vote yes. I'm going to do it for my Wangkumarra people, for their displacement. I'm going to do it for my grandchildren. I've got very young grandchildren, and I want to see that they're recognised for their rightful place in the country as the first peoples of this country. But in seeing them recognised, what we also need to understand that it's not going to impact on 97% of the population. A decision to recognise Indigenous people won't change your lives, but I can tell you it'll change the lives of Indigenous people. And if we've got stronger structures in place to keep government to account, I can assure you we'll get better outcomes than what's been achieved to date by governments. And we've seen the challenges of government overreach. You've experienced the challenge of government overreach in your day-to-day lives when we went through the 2-year period of COVID. Indigenous people have experienced that COVID period for a large majority of their lives, where there have been overreach and people telling you how to do it, when to do it, why you should do it, without consulting those people as to whether or not it's the right thing to do. And I'm certain that if we had greater powers and a recognition within the Constitution when it was developed in 1901, I'm very sure we'd be in a different position than what we are today. And so all we're looking at doing today is going back and correcting a wrong that was developed in 1901. In 1967, our people were counted. In 1967, the federal government were given powers. The powers were taken from the state and given to the federal government. This year, we're wanting a greater say in those powers that the government have over us. We want a greater say in the laws that government make for us, and we want to ensure that those laws have a positive impact and not the negative impact of our past. So thank you very much for coming today. I genuinely appreciate you taking the effort, given that it is an Origin night, and truly appreciate that you've come out to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Robert.
So we've just got a couple of questions here that members of the Newcastle Institute have asked us, sort of when we knew that we were having this event tonight on The Voice, and then we're going to hand it over to you. So one of the first questions, and this has probably been raised in the media, is why does it need the constitutional change rather than legislation?
Well, the constitutional change is about the guarantee, right? Remember, this didn't start with people saying we need a voice to Parliament. This started with white politicians saying we need to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution, then having a conversation about what constitutional recognition meant, and what emerges from that is the need for a guarantee that the future will be different from the past. And you say, and the question's put, well, why can't it be done in legislation? Well, we know a voice could be set up in legislation. We know this because it's been done before. We had ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. It was set up in legislation. Things went awry. There were genuine problems, but the Parliament's response to that was to abolish it, right? Not to reform it, but to abolish it. And that's, that is in living memory. That's in my living memory. It's not so long ago that the Parliament, not just the government, the opposition supported the government in doing this. And what this is about is saying you can't just silence Indigenous people if you don't like the way they're talking, if things go wrong, if it gets messy. It's about the Australian people saying to the Parliament, you have an obligation to make sure these people's voices are heard when you're making laws that affect them. And that's the reason we need the guarantee. And the only way we get the guarantee is if the Australian people impose this obligation on Parliament at a referendum and put in the Constitution the requirement that Parliament makes provision for a voice, not just leave it to Parliament to do it if it feels like it, and then to repeal it when it feels like it.
Just to reinforce what Damien's saying, if we look back through the history of the country, we've had 7 different types of structures set up for Indigenous people to advise government. All 7 have been abolished over time. Even structures that we have established today still struggle to attract the necessary resources to be able to continue to do the work that they do. You know, I've worked for nearly 9 years on setting up a structure called Empowered Communities, which I led for 9 years, or 6 years, sorry, in regards to remote and regional communities, developing structures to give themselves a greater say in decisions that are being made about them at a local level, and basically transferring responsibility from government to communities to step up and lead that change. Those structures are at the whim of changing government every time, and every time there is a new government, you're there at trying to advocate for resources to be able to sustain those structures. The very last structure that we had in place was established by former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, which was a hand-picked Indigenous advisory committee of 6 people with no authority to drive change or no authority to represent Indigenous communities. The structure prior to that was National Congress, and again, National Congress was limited or restricted in regards to resources, and therefore eventually shut down. The voice then prior to that was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. And people have concern in regards to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, but the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, in my view, and particularly the last term, there were some dubious people sitting at the top. But where you have dubious people sitting at the top, you get rid of those people, you don't get rid of the structures. But ATSIC in its last term was probably the most effective structure I've ever seen to really make improvement in Indigenous affairs. I've not seen another body or another structure quite drive the change that was happening at that time. And so where we've advocated for change now is enshrining a voice in the Constitution is about giving us a protection that there will be some structure to be determined by the government, not to be determined by Indigenous people, but to be determined by the government as to what that looks like and how that functions. But there is a guarantee that there will be an Indigenous voice. And that was the most important aspect of what we were asking for with the Uluru Statement.
Thanks, Sean. Assuming a yes vote, and I understand and accept that the government will decide how it operates, it won't be for anyone else to decide other than the government. I'm interested in some of the mechanisms that will be used to actually operationalise it, I suppose. So the mechanisms to determine how members are elected so that they represent local communities, the mechanisms to determine how the issues that are focused on will be chosen, and then what will be done about those issues. Can you suggest what mechanisms you think might be in place to do that?
Yeah, the best resource to go to, I think, in regards to it is the Karma Langton report. Pages 16 to 19 of the Karma Langton report starts to set out the framework as to how the voice might seek representations from communities. One of the interesting things when consultation went out to communities, some communities made the decision that they didn't want to go to elections. They didn't want to actually have an election process. They wanted to be able to determine through their own structures on the ground as to who will represent them. So some of them have very traditional structures. If you go up to Arnhem Land, they've got the Dillac structure, which is a very traditional structure, that structure determines who that person is that is going to represent them in their communities. Other communities may have organisational structures where it's organisations that may represent their voice and so on. So that will be determined by communities as to who it is they want to represent them, and some may actually move to an elected structure. But the types of functions and purposes are really going to be focused on those things that impact on Indigenous people. I might be a little bit different. I probably got an interest in the RBA because I've got a mortgage, and we'd all love to be able to control the decisions of the RBA, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. The Prime Minister doesn't even have that control. But for me, the priorities are what they are. We want our kids to be able to first of all survive being born, and then to be able to go on and thrive in today's society. We want them to have success. We want them to have the same success that you have for your kids, to be able to thrive in today's society. But we want them to be able to do that and not lose who they are as Indigenous people, not to be able to, not to lose their distinct cultural practices and what makes us unique as Indigenous people. You know, and so for us, it is really about putting in structures that recognise our cultural practices and the way in which we go about choosing our leaders, ensuring that those leaders then represent the challenges that exist within our community, and those leaders are advocating our issues at local, state and national levels to be able to ensure information is feeding up and information is feeding down. So no different to the way in which, you know, structures already exist. We have local MPs represent at a local level. They then feed up into a parliament. The only difference here is that we're not going to be the decision makers when it comes to the laws and policies and programs, but we do want to have input into those laws, policies and programs that impact us as Indigenous people.
I happened to be in New York when there was the national apology. Kevin Rudd provided the apology, and it made the front page of the New York Times, and felt immensely proud. And people there spoke to us and said, you know, why is this just happening now? So internationally, people do take notice of this thing. What do you think will be the impact on our international reputation if a yes or a no vote happens?
Well, I think you pointed out it will be noticed overseas. That's clear. People will take notice of it. But look, I don't, you know, I've heard it said, oh, you know, it would be terrible, you know, the international reputation of of Australia would be terrible if we vote no. Maybe that's true, but I think that's a bit beside the point. You know, we should be concerned here about what's good for our country, and, you know, we've come here today to explain why we believe this is good for the country. I think we would be it would be celebrated internationally if we achieve this. I think if we don't, if it's a no vote that prevails, I think it's true that certainly the sorts of countries that we like to compare ourselves with, the sorts of countries that we have most in common with, would probably not be impressed by this. But I would say to you, I don't think that's actually I don't think that should be our concern here. Our concern should be doing what's right for our country, and our, you know, if the right thing to do is something that upsets the rest of the world, well, so be it. We should have the confidence to do that. I think that the right thing to do is to address this problem and to take the solution that's been found here, because it's a good one. But as I say, I think that's a bit of a red herring, because I think, you know, so be it. Let the rest of the world think what they think of us. We have to do what we as Australians believe is right for Australia, and that should be the thing that matters.
I agree with Damien. I think one of the challenges that we have is that we're probably too focused on what's happening in other parts of the world. The reality right now is that there is a unique group of people in the country. The government have the powers to make special laws for this special group of people. All this group of people have asked for is a greater say in those laws that are being made about them. You know, when I think about, pardon me, when I think about the impact, and I think about, you know, let's look at our own history right here in Newcastle. The very first flag flew on the council chamber here in Newcastle. Back then it was a pretty historic moment, but right now we have Aboriginal flags flying across every council building across the country. Also flies on the Harbour Bridge. Now, when you drive over the Harbour Bridge, does that flag actually impact you, or is it, you know, does it create a heavy burden on your soul as you're driving over the bridge and think, oh, that bloody flag's above me head, you know? Probably not. You know, when we think back at the history and we think of the brave woman that put that flag on that building, all I think about is how brave she must have been to make that decision at that time, back in the 1970s. You know, and when I think about Newcastle, and I think about some of those historic moments, for me, Joy Cummings' decision to walk up without council approval, to raise that Aboriginal flag and say, I'm going to draw a line in the sand. And when we think about that decision, it didn't change any of our lives. And when we drive past that building, nothing particularly happens to us other than we look up at this flag and say, and I'd look up at, and I was there the other day for the beginning of NAIDOC week last Monday. And I just stood there and think what a proud moment to know that this was the first council in the country to do that. And I think about how brave Joy Cummings must have been in doing that and making that decision. And it's done nothing but good in regards to how we've progressed as a community here in Newcastle in our relationships with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. You know, and we've progressed that, and we've had conversations, and we've worked through how we're going to build and strengthen that relationship. But it started with someone making the right decision. Not necessarily everyone had to agree with what she did, but she made the right decision. And that decision now has led to Aboriginal flags flying across every building across the council building across the country. As Aboriginal people, we also got to remember that what we've been very good at is incremental change. We're sort of more on the, less about the revolution and more about the evolution as to how we've progressed. You could go to other countries and you're not going to see Indigenous flags flying across every council building across the country or flying on one of the most iconic structures in the country, such as the Harbour Bridge, but we've achieved that here. We've achieved that as a country, and we should celebrate that as a country. You're not going to see acknowledgement of countries at the open, as we did at the opening of this meeting, where a non-Indigenous person can stand up and acknowledge the country in which you're on. When you go to other countries, you're not going to see that, but we've been able to achieve that here. You know, and so when we think about what we've been able to achieve symbolically, we've done substantial things in that space. But we've got to stop and recognise it and celebrate it. And understand as to how did that decision impact me when I made it. Did it change my life? It may have made you feel a little bit more proud to be Australian, but did it change your life directly in that, you know, it completely shifted you, of course, that your whole life fell to pieces? You know, probably not. But I can tell you this decision that we make at this referendum, it will have a significant impact on Indigenous people. By simply recognising that my people had been here for 65,000 years and that we can't be forgotten about in less than 230 years. Less than 230 years, and less than that in regards to the Constitution in 1901. But it can't be forgotten about in less than 230 years. That will have a significant impact on my life, on my kids' life, and it'll have a significant impact on my ancestry, because I know that those decisions were made back then to remove my people of the country. I will be able to move on from that, and I'm going to be able to say, well, I am a proud Wangkumarra person, but I'm also a proud Australian.
Thanks, Sean. Just one last question from here, and then I'll hand it over. The support for the yes vote has, in the polls, has diminished a bit recently, and as you indicated early on, not all the people in the audience, but a lot of the people are in that age group. For those people that want to vote yes, what can they do in their homes, with their families, with their neighbours, or what can be done by the campaign more broadly to try and mobilise people to vote yes?
Look, I think the most important thing is for people to have a conversation, but for me, it's about having an informed conversation. There's the UN have the direct Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and one of the requirements in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is free, prior, informed consent. when it comes to consultation, that Indigenous people, when you're consulting them and you're seeking a decision from them, is that there's free, prior, informed consent. I would like to think and expect that all Australian people will go through that process of prior, and informed consent, that you inform yourself in regards to what this is about. You know, I'm grateful that this debate is out of the Parliament, because, as I said, I think both sides of politics have just made a complete mess of this whole process. And for me now, it is up to the 97% non-Indigenous people to look at whether they support this or not. Now, I can't tell people how to vote, and I'm not going to tell people how to vote. What I can say to people is, do the work, understand the challenges and the issues that exist as to why Indigenous people have asked for this. As Damien said, John Howard in 2007 put out his Act of Recognition speech, saying that we want to recognise Indigenous people's rightful place within our founding document. We then went through a process to understand, from our perspective, how do we want to be recognised. We went through that process that led to the Uluru Statement, which I'm a signature of. I was pleased to say that I'm the second person to sign that document. But we put forward, this is how we want to be recognised as Indigenous people. If we're choosing not to do that, then I don't know how we move forward as a nation if the referendum fails. Because the question then becomes, if the referendum fails, what then do we do? What it will do is it'll reassure Indigenous people of our rightful place in the country, absolutely assure us of that, that our rightful place isn't to be recognised by our fellow Australians. And that's the harsh reality of what that means. That is what that will mean, and that was the message. Now, I'll move on. I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I'll move on and I'll continue to advocate and I'll continue to do what I do. But, you know, a lot of people will be devastated by that. And I think that's the reality of what it is we need to come to grips with as a community, what it needs to come to grips with as individuals, and how do we then have those conversations within our families. Because we do need to have those conversations within our families, and then understand, you know, how do we move forward, because there's also going to be a process of how we move forward if the referendum succeeds. You know, we've got to work through that process, but we've also got to work forward if the referendum fails. How do we then move forward in that conversation? So it is going to be interesting time ahead.
Look, I'll just add one observation to that about how we have these conversations, those of us who believe this is the right thing to do and who believe this is a good solution to the problem. And that is, I have to say, I feel very uncomfortable with people who agree with me, who like to brand our opponents as, if not racist, as peddling misinformation. I think it's really important to admit that these people have arguments, and arguments need to be refuted. And I understand why some people, like Greg Sheridan, argue against this. You know, I've read it, I understand, he's got arguments. I've written a paper with Greg Craven for the Centre for Independent Studies that provides an alternative perspective. But the point I say is people have arguments, and we should acknowledge that, and we should explain why we don't think they're good arguments, why we should refute them, and we should explain why we think there are better reasons for voting yes. And I think it's really important to understand that people of goodwill can disagree, but we can have a proper conversation and we can explain why we are not persuaded by other people's arguments and why we think there are better arguments.
Also, Robin, I don't know if anyone where people are living. I live in the Charlestown area. Just recently had a mail drop, which is the brochure that Peter Dutton produced. I don't. Have any of you received that in the mail as yet? Yep. So it's the no brochure that Peter Dutton had put out in his electorate. Ollie Hughes has just put it out in my electorate of the Charlestown area. The types of things you've got to break down in that, it says costs. You know, that in 2022-23, the federal government spent $4.3 billion or $4.3 billion on the National Indigenous Australians Agency. Well, who was in government prior to 2022-2023? And what did they spend? I can tell you they spent the exact same amount. And then when you go back to the year before that, or the government before that, they spend the exact same amount. And when you go back to the government before that, they spend the exact same amount. At the moment, we spend $36 billion annually in the name of Indigenous affairs, and we've been doing that consistently since 2008. And still not getting the outcomes that are needed. $36 billion. Commonwealth Bank made a profit this year of $9 billion, but we're still spending more than, 3 times more than what the Commonwealth Bank made in regards to its profits. 36 billion annually, 6 billion directly in the name of Indigenous people. We've gone and done the work that tells us that 30 cents in every dollar hits the ground in community. And so when you look at the bureaucracy and the structures and you actually work through and try to understand these challenges, and you think $36 billion, that's not acceptable from my perspective as an Indigenous person. It shouldn't be accepted from your perspective as non-Indigenous Australians. We should not accept that is the case, but we do. We do, and I can tell you we're going to continue to spend that when the next government is elected, because that's what they've been consistently doing for the last 12, 13, 14 years. And if we don't do something different, and we're still expecting to get different outcomes, then we seriously need to have a good look at ourselves as a nation. Because I'm sick of the Close the Gap report. It does nothing but depress me. Why would we have a report, a Closing the Gap report, that compares my life experiences with non-Indigenous people's life experiences, but expect me to live to the same age as non-Indigenous people? Where does that even make sense in the reality of the real world, that Indigenous people are compared against non-Indigenous people when it comes to health targets, education targets, and all of those other types of targets, that we have been milestone and checked against non-Indigenous Australians? Let's look at where Indigenous people are having success, and let's measure Indigenous success against those Indigenous people and set that as the benchmark for Indigenous people to work to. The expectation as to how long I live shouldn't be determined by non-Indigenous people. It should be determined as to how I'm measured against other Indigenous people who have got similar experiences and have come through similar traumas and challenges that I've come through, to determine whether or not I'm doing all right as a person. Yeah. And I think other Indigenous people would probably be marked against myself as well. But it needs to be like for like. You can't compare apples and oranges, which is the way in which we currently do it. That tells me the system's broken, and we've been doing that since 2008. We've been measuring Indigenous people that way since 2008. And that tells me that governments, consecutive governments, and regardless of their politics, have completely failed in their understanding as to how to measure Indigenous people when it comes to success. That's not a politics thing. That's just a failure of governments doing things the same and expecting different outcomes.
Okay, I'm going to hand over the questions to you now. So we've got a roving mic. Do you want 2? Just one. There's one.
It might just be me, but I've heard a lot of negativity and negative criticisms about the Voice proposal. Maybe it's targeted me because I'm older than 65. But I haven't heard the argument that was presented by Damien tonight that to me struck a real chord, which is that Aboriginal people are the only ones that are subject to federal paternalistic laws but they don't have a voice in how those laws apply to them. To me, that struck a real chord. It seems a really powerful argument. When are those sort of arguments going to be presented to the wider community to respond to the negativity that's out there?
Well, I don't. You probably know more than I do about what's going on behind the scenes. Look, I agree. You know, we have to make these sorts of arguments, and all I can say is yes, I understand your concern that a lot of what's being talked about doesn't resonate with people. When I first got involved with this, I remember having a meeting with someone who's very senior now in the government, but the point was made at that meeting and said, you know, people speak, it's almost like we speak different languages, you know. This was the point that was made, like people on the left and people on the right, they speak different languages, even when they are looking for the same outcome. How they explain why it's a good idea is very different. And look, I can only say I'm encouraging people to try to get out and make these sorts of arguments, because I think people need to hear these sorts of arguments. And before I came up here today, I had a tradie at my place when I was speaking to ABC Newcastle, and he was listening to me talking, doing the radio interview, and then he said afterwards, he said, "Oh, you know, I've heard a lot of going on about this, but you know, you spoke more sense about it in that 10 minutes than everything I've been hearing, and you know, and I found that you were actually reassuring me about a lot of the concerns I had." So look, I get it. There are concerns, and we should be concerned. You know, it's right that we need to address those concerns.
Am I allowed 2 questions for equity reasons, one each? Damien, you spoke in almost reverential terms about the Constitution, and Sean, you mentioned that in the Constitution, the original Constitution, was a failure to recognise Indigenous people. It was worse than that. It was a deliberate exclusion. 51 and 127 were the only references, and they deliberately excluded them. That was predicated on the belief at the time that Aboriginal people would die out. Alfred Deakin, who was the first Attorney General and the second Prime Minister, he said in 1901 that you know, I think they're dying in the east. You know, we're making their passing as comfortable as possible, but specifically, he said that we don't expect to see a brown or a black face in Australia in 100 years' time. Now, that was partly corrected in 1967, but the fact remains that the original Constitution was racist and it was wrong. And that has to be corrected. All the emphasis seems to be on the voice and not on the fact that the Constitution needs to be corrected because it was wrong. Is it a deliberate strategy not to sort of criticise the Constitution? Or that's to you, Damien. Do you want the other one now, and then Sean can think about it? All right, I'll try to be quick. Sean, the voice to me sounds like it's going to be a review mechanism where a proposed legislation is brought to you in the very early stages, and you're invited to comment on it. Will you have an advocacy role? And can I give a simple case in point? The wife and I did more than 20,000 kilometres travelling around New South Wales a couple of years ago, went to very many small communities. In Wilcannia, we went into the only supermarket to get a box of cereal, and a small box of cereal was $8. And this is reflected all around, particularly in remote communities where they're paying outrageous prices. So that means that diets are affected, everything is affected, health is affected. Is this the sort of area where the voice could also have an advocacy role, where they could go to executive or to government and say, look, this is a problem that needs to be fixed. If you can subsidise petrol for farmers, why can't you do something to make food more affordable? Thank you.
Well, I've got the mic, so I'll go first. Look, you're right when you say I speak in you said almost reverential terms. I'd be happy to say in reverential terms. I do revere the Founding Fathers. I do think they did a very good job. When I say I think they did a good job, I see the Constitution as basically doing two things. The Constitution brought together 6 independent colonies voluntarily. The British government wasn't prepared to force them as they did in Canada. It happened here only because it was voluntary, and they wanted to do it. And it negotiated terms on which they were all prepared to come in, and it established a new entity, the Commonwealth of Australia, and it set up the relations between the Commonwealth and the states. Okay, now we think there are some problems with that. But the other thing it did is it created the institutions of the Commonwealth, the Parliament, the High Court, the government, and it set up the relations between them. And I admire the way all of that was done. I think that was all done very well and very effectively, and I think we've got, we have benefited over 100 years from that. To say that they were brilliant draftsmen, to say that they understood the tradition of representative government that existed in England and that they had been transplanted here, isn't to say they were perfect people. And yes, the truth is they subscribed to the kind of the idea of race that was prevalent in the 19th century, that has been rejected after the Second World War. They did think that race was a real thing in a way that we now reject, right? So the anthropologists and the scientists now will basically say ethnicity is a real thing, race is not, and they distinguish ethnicity from race, right? And this was a feature. We know that what happened with this false concept of race that led to Nazism and the kinds of ways of thinking there. And look, yes, the Founding Fathers, when it comes to race, were men of their age, and they had the prejudices of their age. That's true. By and large, I don't think that infects the core bits of the Constitution, right? When you look at the relationship between the states and the Commonwealth, when you look at the relationship between the Parliament, the Crown, and the High Court, I don't think that affects that in a really bad way. It's true that it creeps in these sort of side notes that we wouldn't have accepted now, and it shouldn't be there. And yes, it is indeed my reverence, as I say to people, if you value the Constitution, that's the reason we should be addressing this. So this is not some sort of cunning plan on my part. It's a genuine belief that if you actually value the Constitution and you think it's done well, then it's affirming the Constitution to say we will address this problem because it will enhance the Constitution in the end.
Just in regards to advocacy will continue to happen in the space. What I learned quite a few years back now is that I do less work with government these days to get outcomes in Indigenous communities than I do with the corporates. I chair the Commonwealth Bank's Indigenous Advisory, and we're doing lots of work with Indigenous communities, particularly around reducing carbon emissions. Some of our biggest procurement agreements to reduce carbon emissions is with Aboriginal communities in remote communities around savanna burning and so on. I also sit on the Woolworths Advisory Board, and so that gives me the opportunity to advocate to Woolworths around how do we get fresh foods and products into communities. But interesting enough, when I first went onto the Woolworths Advisory Board, they put a proposal to the advisory and said, oh, look, we want to continue to provide breakfast programs for kids in remote communities. And I said, why would we do that? Why do we take the responsibility away from parents to feed their kids, and we take on that role of feeding the kids? Our job is to ensure that we're providing fresh, affordable food to communities. Let's focus on doing our jobs and ensure that we do it well and get fresh, affordable food to the communities. One of the best community stores I went to was a little community called Millingimby. It's a little island off Arnhem Land. Amazing store. I got some bottles of water and then I got some food, and when I went to pay for it, it cost me $7. I got about 4 bottles of water, and I went back to the counter and I said, I think I just ripped you off. And she goes, what do you mean? So she went and checked it and she wasn't sure, and then she went and got someone else and they checked it. And I said, oh, well, I bought these bottles of water. And she said, yeah, they're $1 each. And so through that type of advocacy, we are getting cheaper products to those communities and fresher products into those communities. Government have a role to play, but they don't have the only role. They have a role as an enabler and a supporter, but corporates also have a responsibility to play in regards to how we ensure that community have access to good resources and so on. The worst example of government overreach, just to give you the example, was Nigel Scullion as the Minister for Indigenous Affairs sitting on a bus, driving to people's homes, knocking on the door, getting the kids, putting them on the bus and driving them to school. Not the job of a minister. Your job is to set policy to ensure that the school is delivering good quality programs that the kids and the parents want to get up to get their kids on the bus to get them to school. And this is the failure of government overreach in the communities where they're doing the work of parents and are not allowing parents to take responsibility for the things that they are responsible for. This is what I advocate for. This is what Noel Pearson advocates for. This is what the empowered communities leaders advocate for right across the country, is to get governments out of our lives and to allow our people to start to lead and drive the change that exists. And until we get to that point, we can't expect anything to change, because we've created a world of dependency that our people have, learned to survive on, unfortunately.
Sean, you mentioned the no brochure earlier and mentioned one of the arguments against case. I haven't seen that brochure yet. Would you be able to go through maybe a few other of the no cases and how you'd refute those, please? Just a couple of other examples in the brochure.
Yes, Damien's got a copy of it.
Damien didn't have a smartphone.
You wouldn't believe it, Damien's only just converted to a smartphone. He still had the old press button phone. Look, I think what you're going to get out there is the same old arguments, that it's a racist body and so on. And as Damien said, race is in the Constitution. It exists in the Constitution. But this is not about race. This is about indigeneity. This is about recognising that there was a group of people here for 65,000 years, and that group of people can't be forgotten about in less than 230 years. So it talks about what is the referendum about, what is unknown. Australia hasn't changed its constitution by referendum since 1977. So that's an unknown. It's a big decision, yet Labor refused to reveal any details before the vote. Now let's talk about this concept of detail. Let's go back to when John Howard first announced this in 2007. We've had the Liebler the expert panel report led by Mark Liebler. We had the Dodson-Lisa work that was co-chaired by Patrick Dodson and Julian Lisa. We had the Karma Langton report, which is a 178-page report, I think, in regards to their work. We had the Uluru Conventions that we went through in regards to that process. The detail is there. We've got to understand that this started with a Conservative Prime Minister. Every Prime Minister, and we've had quite a few of them, unfortunately, since John Howard, but every Prime Minister since have picked this up in some form or another and have progressed it to where we are today. And so that question of not enough detail is really rubbish. It's just a non-argument. Labor is putting the cart before the horse, so that's talking about why shouldn't we legislate first, and why not go to the referendum. The referendum is exactly what it is. It's about putting in place a voice that gives Indigenous people a greater say in laws and policies that are made about them, but it's also given the protections. When it comes to the legislation, everyone sitting in this room will have no input or no role to play in the legislation. What role do we have to play in legislation right now? Why is there then an expectation that Indigenous people should be working through and developing up the legislation for this to go to the Parliament, when right now for all legislation across the country, unless you're some big representative group out there, you might get a say and input into how that legislation impacts you. But right now, everyday Australians don't get a say in legislation and how legislation is developed or impacted in regards to them. That is the role of politicians. And so both sides of Parliament, in fact all politicians, will have the opportunity to develop that legislation and design it as to how it is they want it to design and function, and they will do that without any input from us, because that is their role as lawmakers within the country. And so that passing the buck and saying, well, we want the detail now because we don't know, they're going to be in the box seat when it comes to the detail. Perhaps what we should be questioning is when they're ready to do that detail, you know, as everyday Australians, we want to make sure that it's effective and it's going to do the right thing to improve outcomes for Indigenous people. There's some other things there.
One thing I'd just say about that detail quickly, it's really important that the way this has been designed is precisely that the Constitution does not specify that kind of detail, because to do that is to limit the Parliament, right? The whole point of how this has been designed is to say Parliament will have control over the way this is set up. Parliament can decide everything about the way this thing operates, and that is the reason that there is no detail set out in the Constitution. It's a quite deliberate thing, that it is deliberate so that it gives power to Parliament rather than taking power away from Parliament.
Just addition to that, you also run the risk that if you sit legislation alongside the referendum process, there is a risk that the Australian people will tie the legislation to the referendum, which therefore may make it difficult in the future for politicians to change that legislation. If the Australian people believe that they've voted on this particular model at the referendum, as Damien said, it may then make it difficult for politicians to change that legislation if you tie the two together. And so it's been a deliberate process, but the process ensures that the Parliament have the powers to make to develop the legislation and do that design.
Hello. I'm not going to stand up because I'll get too breathless if I do. Thank you very much, Sean and Damien. And I think probably most people in this room recognise that we've had abysmal failure by government and by the executive, if you like, by the public service, in terms of the executive of the public service, in terms of the development of policies and programs that were imposed on Aboriginal people from above, and where there was no consultation. And to me, it's as simple as when I worked in occupational health and safety, say with cleaners or with railway fettlers who had really high rates of back injury, occupational overuse syndrome, neck injury, shoulders, the works. To find out why that was happening, what do? You go and ask the people who are doing the job. Working with those in a higher position in government or executive in the public service, etc., they have their ideas as to why it's happening. Often it's blame the worker. And the real reasons it's happening and the reason why there is no effective change is because they do not consult. In another way of saying this, I'm really concerned that the government has done such a poor job on selling this, and that the opposition has been able to get away with saying we haven't got enough detail, etc. To me, it is a really simple thing. It is, health, education, etc., the really important things, have been abject failures because the people were not consulted. And to say we don't have enough detail when all it is being asked is that government listens to the representatives of Aboriginal people to find out why the policies and programs are failing and what needs to be done. And it's a very simple thing. That's not us whites giving away our power. That's not treating the Aboriginal people as a special group of people. Why can they have that and we can't? It is a really common sense to be doing. So one of my questions is, why have the politicians particularly failed so badly in trying to sell what to me is a very, very simple concept, that you ask the people who do the work or have the experience to find out what's wrong, why it's failing and how you're going to fix it. So that's one question.
We have to just leave it at one today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Look, I think the politicians are politicians, and one doing that. I also want to acknowledge the work of your late husband, who was a great mentor and support to me over a long period of time. But we've got to understand the structure of Parliament and how it operates, and it's very rare that you actually get politicians on opposing sides come together and agree on a position. I'll tell you, from my perspective, I think the process was wrong in regards to that you don't bring 21 Indigenous people together in a working group to push forward a proposal where we need 97% of the population to vote support it. There should have been non-Indigenous people involved in that process. You don't bring 61 members of the referendum working group together, just made up of 100% Indigenous people. There should have been non-Indigenous people included in that process. That was a fundamental mistake. And I tried to advocate to have that change, because we need the 97%, or we needed people in that room who could go out and continue to speak to the 97%. So setting it up that way, for me, was a flaw in the process. I can tell you, sitting in the working group room, Julian and Dutton had ample opportunity, and they attended the meetings twice, and Julian, I think, 3 times. Unfortunately, when they come in, they didn't come in to want to have a conversation or to talk about a way forward. They come in for the purpose of the media to say, well, I've attended that, I've done my bit, now I've walked away. And Julian's a really good friend of mine, and Julian's leadership in this space has been, I have nothing but the utmost respect that he made the decision to resign from the shadow cabinet, which potentially risked what his political future might look like. As to whether he gets a ministerial role in the future or not, I don't know. But he had the courage to stand by the work that he's done over the many years to do that. So there are politicians, I believe, who have behaved exceptionally well in this space, and there are politicians, I think, who have just behaved badly. I don't think there's a right or wrong on either side, because I think there could have been improvements in the process. I think I go back to Malcolm Turnbull and Barnaby Joyce, where their first response to the Uluru Statement. That for me was an absolute disgrace. Now Malcolm has since turned his position, thanks to a lot of work that we've done to better educate and inform him on that. However, it was unnecessary and unhelpful to make that statement and not consider why Indigenous people put the position forward that we did. And there are times all the way throughout that we've been challenged by the behaviour of politicians all the way through this process. Last week was NAIDOC week in Newcastle, and we did our annual march from Civic down to the park. And there's an elderly gentleman there that lived here for a long time, Owen Craigie's dad. And he come up to me at the rally and he said, I've got to have a yarn. He said, I live in Tamworth these days, He said Barnaby Joyce, Pauline Anson, Warren Mundine all stood on the stage, and he said they've created so much division and racism within our communities. You know, he says, I don't know what to do about it. He said, I'm struggling to work through a solution. And this is a man that spent many years working in the police force as a police liaison officer, one of the very first Aboriginal police liaison officers, sitting there in despair because they brought this circus into Tamworth, which has created racial division within their community because of the behaviour of these people. You know, it's just unfortunate, but it's politicians, and we can't control the politicians and what they do. But what we've got to remember right now, that the referendum vote, it's not going to be the politicians that make that decision and to determine the outcome. It's the Australian people. It is you sitting in this room who is going to determine the outcome of the referendum. And that's why I'm so pleased that it's out of that space and we're now having the conversation with the Australian people.
Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank both of you for lucid and insightful comments. But there is a clock ticking. We don't know when the referendum will be, but there is a clock ticking. And it seems to me so much of the debate and discussion that there is about the voice is about power. And I think what the no vote, the no supporters have done is basically make it a contest of power that says if we have a voice, somebody loses. And the way the no vote, some of the no comments have been phrased is that the voice will represent power that is taken from others. And I'd be very interested in how you would suggest that those of us who want the voice to succeed should aim to try to counter that sort of really quite duplicitous frame that's been put on the voice.
Yeah, look, this proposal has been designed precisely to avoid changing the way power works under the Australian Constitution. Right. That's completely, you know, I can explain in a lot more detail why it's been done the way it is, but it is precisely so that Parliament retains the power it has, the High Court retains the power it currently has. I think the other thing that's important to remind people is this is intended to enable Indigenous people to be heard before the race's power is exercised to make special laws for Indigenous people. And we can't, the other thing I have to say, people then say to me, oh, but why don't we get rid of the race's power? We just shouldn't be making special laws for Indigenous people. And you have to understand we can't do that because the Parliament needs to retain that power. The Parliament needs to have power to amend the Native Title Act, right? Some people think it goes too far, some people think it doesn't go far enough. Everyone agrees Parliament has to retain the power that it has. The important thing to understand here is that this is a way of addressing the concerns Indigenous people have precisely without changing the way power is exercised under the Constitution. It enables their voices to be heard, but it doesn't change the way power operates under the Constitution. And I think that's the special achievement of it.
Okay. Inevitably, we've run a little bit over time, and we're even running up to State of Origin for those who are obsessed by that. But this has been a very special night. The Newcastle Institute, we aim to have a rational discussion of diverse ideas and foster a respectful, intelligent consideration of new ideas. And we've had great nights, but this has really been an example par excellence of what we're trying to achieve. And so Sean, Damien and Robin, who did most of the work in putting all this together, thank you very much for a great night. So next month, August the 9th, same place, same time place, 6 o'clock here. We have focusing on crime and criminology. Speaker is Don Weatherburn, who is the Director of the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, previously and for a long time from the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. Had all that written out because I didn't, otherwise I get it mixed up. And I've seen his draft presentation, and it is really challenging. A lot of counterintuitive. May have heard him on radio at times or in the media. Challenges a lot of preconceptions and home truths and what's really going on with regard to crime. And so I've said his topic is the truth about crime today. Robbery, break-ins, illegal drugs, alcohol-fueled violence, car theft, and more. So he's recently published a book called The Vanishing Criminal, which I don't think is about people who suddenly become invisible and break into your house. But I think it'll be a very interesting night. So August the 9th, Don Weatherburn, tell your friends, and thank you for coming.